In part 2, I conclude my conversation with Martin Mansergh. But staying on Ireland and moving from the positive to the negative, if we may, for a second. I know you're a very positive person, so I hesitate to even ask.
You actually have to be, I think, to be a politician or to be an effective politician. I remember Charles Hoyt. I can't remember whether I drafted this for him or whether he invented it himself in a speech to the New Ireland Forum, listening to a couple of gloomy prognostications by economists, and him saying, if economics is the dismal science, then politics must be the profession of hope. And I think, if you don't have some belief that you can do things to change things or influence things, well then, what's the point?
Well, we're looking back now, so we can with some academic detachment survey the past,
and we have the benefit of hindsight.
Yes,
to a degree,
and we can look back and see, well, maybe this was not a good development in Ireland. So, is there anything that comes into your mind?
Well, I mentioned already the drugs issue.
Yes,
that would be the major negative.
Was that unavoidable? I mean, was that just part of a global thing?
I think probably, but nonetheless, global developments also take on local dimensions.
In other words, could we have stopped it, or was it inevitable that it would sweep through?
Not altogether. But nonetheless, I mean, you're asking me about phenomena that turn up in Ireland, and so that would be the major thing that I would regret. Now, I would also have quite strong, as I'm not close to it quite deliberately, so is I think the abuse of social media and the abusiveness on social, that's not a good development, because you've got a sort of public sphere, including newspapers and broadcast media and so on, where you have to be careful of people's reputations. But anonymously online, you can shred people to pieces, and I mean, this matters most of all in, say, the teenage classroom. Yes. Where people are occasionally driven to suicide.
Yes.
By a horrible thing said. I think we're going to have to find some way of making social media more accountable and responsible. I mean, I don't actually approve of people being able to send, abusive anonymous messages. I always had respect when I was a Minister of State. Anyone in politics will get some unpleasant messages from time to time. But I always a certain amount of respect for ones that were signed with a name and address given, and very often I would reply to them, and if I thought they had gone overboard, I would say, I'm not sure you did yourself full justice by the way you put that argument, and I think people were very surprised to get a reply sometimes. But that does worry me a bit, that you've got a kind of uncontrolled and a bile and a lot. And you see, you also find, and I find this with younger generation, they're a completely different way of sort of picking up news, and a lot of them don't read few newspapers or anything like that, and one wonders whether they're getting as good a quality service overall. I mean, there are clearly pluses and minuses through social media.
You must have received in your time, lots of, well, maybe not lots, but a number of anonymous hate letters when you were a minister, when you were in the peace process.
Not many. Not well, none during the peace. Well, none worth talking. I mean, anything I got during the peace process, or almost anything, would have been signed occasionally. But you see, they could come from different sources. I mean, I would occasionally have an anonymous message from somebody purporting to be of a similar background to myself, expressing disgust at my political involvement, and so on. You see, these things can come from a number of different directions. They don't always necessarily come from one direction.
But how would you react to something like that? Would you just shrug it off, or would you take it seriously?
Actually, no. And generally speaking, I kept them. You never know when it might be necessary to check them. So I tended not to dispose of anonymously. But I don't think I got any particularly large quantity. See, one of the things I would have learnt in politics is, if you come from, and I would say this would be true of a few people, if you come from, say, like I do, a minority cultural background, you can sometimes assume that if you are receiving negativity from some source, that it's because of that, or that it's something unusual. The thing you see in politics is every politician, without exception, has their enemies and their rivals. And people will pick on, I've seen this with various Taoiseachs, will pick on whatever is perceived to be their weak spots and hammer away at them. I mean, Bertie, for example, was criticised from certain sources by the way he articulated certain words. Haughey was seen as a bit of an upstart, and so on. I mean, everybody has their. I mean, look at some of Radke's comments about some of the things that have been said to him or about him. The truth of the matter is everybody gets knocks in life. Regardless of where you're coming from, whether it's rich, poor, or somewhere in between, and so on. And so, not to take some of these things too personally, and of things that ever depressed me, I can't remember anonymous messages ever being among them.
But you're saying that nowadays young people are receiving vast more quantities of this kind of stuff. They are. And they're less, I suppose, equipped to.
Well, I suppose a lot of folks, even young ones, are relatively robust and hardy, but there's always a certain percentage who are not.
Yes,
and that's where the problem arises. But I'm looking at also from the other end is, should you be free to send anonymous abusive messages, say, to your next door neighbour? And I would say no, you're not. Well, I think to be fair, it is something that the political system is gradually going to have to come to terms with. You see, there's no point in having a sort of a heavily regulated area, GDPR, stiff libel laws, etc., and then on the other side, a situation where anything goes.
Yes.
Some order has to be brought to that, and clearly that'll be a task for the future, and particularly concentrating on those things that can have extremely negative consequences.
Shall we focus on the future?
Yes.
And look at Ireland again, specifically under two headings. This is pure speculation, so you can say whatever comes into your mind. First of all, is there anything in particular you would cite as perhaps Ireland's greatest opportunity?
Well, our biggest opportunity, whether it comes to anything is another matter, but our biggest opportunity is that we are, from the end of this month, going to be the only English-speaking or mainly English-speaking country in the European Union.
Okay.
okay. You can say Malta and Cyprus. There's a fair bit of English-speaking Malta, particularly, but I mean, they're population-wise, they're micro in comparison with Ireland. So I think we have, and we're also a member of the Eurozone. So I think we have huge economic opportunities if people, and it only needs to be a certain limited percentage, people particularly from America but elsewhere want to establish an English-speaking environment inside the European Union. Well, Ireland is the obvious place to go. So I think we are going to be provided we play our hands sensibly. We're going to find ourselves a lot in demand. Now, this is going to, already is, creating strains.
Strains where exactly?
No, strains of congestion,
okay.
Services that need to be expanded and modernised and so on. I mean, that's really what we're facing now. We've got a sharply rising population, nearly 5 million now, and scheduled to be probably 6 million by 2040 or so. And we've got to provide housing, health, transport, etc., 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 for people, and in certain places the system is already creaking under the strain. And then, of course, there is people's, so far anyway, improved health and longevity and so on. I mean, one of the things where I surprised myself was when I reached the age of 70. I've just passed my 73rd birthday, but I thought I'd be rather depressed, but actually I felt very cheerful. And the reason I felt very cheerful was that when I was young, 70 was about the age you'd expect to live, when that was about your life expectancy. So to have reached that, and indeed to go beyond it, of course, last autumn we celebrated our golden wedding. I take more pleasure in the idea. Well, actually, I've had a pretty good run, rather than thinking too much about. Well, sure, we know it's all going to end, but
yes.
And of course, how it ends matters. But
you are thinking about this possible opportunity for Ireland.
Yes, it's very important how the hand is played. I think there is possibility, even likelihood, but certainly not inevitability. The country in 20, 30 years' time will be united. Now, paradoxically, that's more likely to happen if we don't constantly agitate at it now. And I see no basis for a border poll, unless and until it's fairly clear there is a majority for change. And I think that is bound to involve some people from a unionist background coming round to the view. Now, a lot will depend on exactly how Brexit plays out. Now, you have to take probably all political statements, but statements of the Johnson government with a certain pinch of salt. But anyway, if you take them at face value, their saying is, no, we're definitely going to diverge from EU standards and regulations. Well, if that is so, the gap between Northern Ireland and Britain, because Northern Ireland is effectively staying in the single market and the customs union de facto, not de jure, and the more Great Britain diverges, then Northern Ireland will still be able to send its goods into Britain. That's no problem. It's part of the same state and the same market. But in terms of goods coming the other way, that may be more difficult to the extent that they diverge, particularly if they're destined for this side of the border. And I mean, the EU will be watching very closely, obviously, and we will have to, in our own self-interest, that Ireland isn't used as a sort of backdoor conduit into the European Union. So I think, I mean, that would be part of the influence influence on it. But I mean, Northern Ireland is going to be diverging to a certain extent from Britain. Now, it would be much better, nonetheless, if the UK had stayed in the European Union. But anyway, I took it after the vote. I took it as a working assumption that Brexit would happen, with a lot of dramas along the way. That indeed is what is happening. But as I say, the post-Brexit situation does create a lot of potential opportunities for Ireland. Now, it does also. There are potential downsides, and I'm not disputing that, not least for an industry that I'm involved in, which is farming. But I think in net terms, there's more opportunities than dangers.
But that particular possibility you see as a clear opportunity rather than anything negative, the possibility of Ireland becoming a single political entity.
Yes, if it provided the progress towards it is paced.
Yes.
Remember, and this is something that was worked into the Good Friday Agreement explicitly, if there is to be a united Ireland, there has to be a referendum north and south of the border. There has to be effectively agreement on the terms and conditions. And we're not going to have a sort of Brexit situation, well, you vote for Brexit in principle, and we'll tell you the details afterwards, and they're still not able to tell us the details. You know? That would be disaster. And you see, and I think the northern establishment, by which I mean the economic interests there, the business, the trade unions, the farmers, they want to do things in such a way that doesn't damage their economic prosperity or their standard of living, and that's been their main, which is why they parted company from the DUP, because the DUP seemed to be putting the sort of purely political ahead of economic self-interest. So I think if we are all sensible north and south of the border, and I mean, against the background of slow, but not that slow, demographic change. And I'm not assuming, of course, that all Catholics and nationalists in the north will vote for a united Ireland. But over 20, 30 years' time, I think that's certainly something that would happen. Now, I mean, I think the situation created by the Good Friday Agreement, and after a battle, it appears that we have succeeded in maintaining the status quo, is that there is no longer an economic border in Ireland, and thousands cross the border in both directions to work in the other jurisdiction. And as you know, the dairy industry in particular, north of, say, the Dublin-Galway line, is totally integrated, and all that is to be preserved. You see, I think unity and partition, and this goes right back to 1922. You're actually in some ways talking about a spectrum rather than black and white. You see, even in the early days, certain things, the churches remained all Ireland institutions, certain sporting and cultural.
Yes.
A cultural body I belong to, the Royal Irish Academy, has a 32-county remit, and so on.
The last question really then is the corollary, I suppose, of what we've just been talking about, and that is to think in terms of the future threats that may face Ireland. Is there anything that you perceive as a threat to Ireland?
Well, I suppose there is no threat that sufficient stupidity can't conjure up, we're now members. I mean, I suppose in the unlikely event that the EU, the Eurozone would break up, obviously that would create, because we're now in a very comfortable multilateral, multinational environment. The Commonwealth, because it was imposed, it didn't particularly suit us. And in any case, such benefits as there were mostly related to the British-Irish relationship, and to a degree they continued after we left, things like the common travel area and so on. But I mean, the EU, we've been pretty comfortable in, and we've had our fair share of the top slots. I mean, 2 secretaries general of the Commission in succession to each other, a man and a woman. And in recent years, Phil Hogan is doing very well. Now Trade Commissioner, having been out, but that's a step up, I think, from having been Agriculture Commissioner. And Pat Cox, President of the European Parliament. I think we've had our fair share of benefits of EU membership, and as I say, it has sort of pushed us up to a quite different rung from where we were. So if that were to break up, that would be a threat. I suppose there is always the threat, one would hope remote, nuclear holocaust of some description. Clearly, environmental pressures. Now, here you see, I think it's the external environment that matters more than. I mean, it doesn't seem to me. I mean, the climate has changed a bit here during my lifetime. In particular, the winters are less cold. The summers are not really any hotter, and I think the statistics bear it out compared with what they were in the 50s and 60s. But I think the environmental threat is that, in a lot of other countries, I think you see we're in a kind of transition zone between, there could even be, some benefits from climate change if we just looked at the island on its own. But if you look at the wider global environment, I mean, obviously this will create huge pressures in migration and so on. I mean, there are problems that now the problem is that you can not definitively prove, like an academic a mathematical equation or something, that climate change is responsible for the forest fires in Australia. But I mean, there are clearly very plausible linkages, and I can see that creating lots of pressure. I mean, and we are getting pressures, to do things, to combat climate change, some of which will be reasonably comfortable and we'll be easily able to adapt to. But, there are folks that want us to close down Irish farming as we've known it and things like that. So I mean, those. But I mean, we'll have to fight our corner. And my view is we're quite good at fighting our corner. Yes. And in particular, and this is particularly true in a kind of European context, we're very good at networking. And I think the sort of. You see, after the Brexit vote, I mean, the worry of many people, myself included, is, well, will Ireland be ignored or forgotten? And in fact, far from being ignored or forgotten, we became absolutely centre stage to the entire negotiation. And one other very pleasant surprise was that I had feared that if the British vote went the way it did, that there would be some mushrooming of folks in this a part of the country that would want to follow suit. And to my pleasant surprise, I mean, the number of people who advocate an our exit, virtually you could count them on the fingers one or two well-known commentators, and that's pretty well it. And I mean, there is a small political party, I've forgotten its name for the moment, that something like the Irish Freedom Party or something like that. But I mean, they're going absolutely nowhere. So I mean, it's a pleasant surprise how united we've been on that subject.
Yes. But you've mentioned a number of threats, and you've mentioned them in the context of how remote they might be. The breakup of the EU or the Eurozone, the nuclear threat, and the possibility of climate change impinging upon us, maybe perhaps in relation to agriculture, and therefore because there's so many cattle in Ireland.
The problem is we have a very environmentally friendly way of farming. I mean, if you go to Germany, for example, and I've seen this in Hessen. I mean, the cattle are kept indoors throughout the year, and they are sort of fed arable crops, oats and straw and all the rest of it. And I think our farming is far more environmentally friendly. But the problem is that everybody has to contribute. Is that we don't get adequate credit for the fact that we're engaged in very environmentally friendly farming. So I mean that there is that.
That sounds like a future battle.
Now, obviously, we are going to have to disperse. I mean, for Europe, we're one of the lowest density populations. I mean, the Republic is a larger territory than Benelux combined. And their population, I don't know what their combined population is, but probably 20 million plus, We have plenty of space in this country, and we need to spread out better to other main centres. Now, I think Cork, to a certain extent, is benefiting from the state of the economy, but there are other places as well. So we have to prevent. Counteract excessive centralisation around Dublin.
Well, I think on that note we will say that's it for today, and I would like to thank Martin Mansergh for sharing his thoughts with us. Please join us for our next show, which will be coming up soon. Goodbye.